Billionaire marries a stranger by contract, but when he discovers her terrifying connection to his ex-wife, everything changes. Hello, my beautiful family. Welcome back to the channel. You have no idea how much your comments and love keep me going. Yesterday I was reading through some of your messages while drinking coffee and I almost cried. Happy tears, I promise. You're not just viewers, you're my people. Before we jump in, tell me quick, did the last story give you chills? Drop a yes in the comments if it did. Now, let's begin. The evening light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting amber shadows across the mahogany desk where the contract lay waiting. At 38, Brian had built an empire that most men only dreamed of. Luxury hotels, tech startups, real estate across 3 continents. Yet tonight, as he stared at the marriage contract bearing Pamela Simons's fresh signature, he felt like the struggling entrepreneur he'd once been, signing his first desperate loan agreement. His fingers drummed against the leather desk pad, a nervous habit from his early business days. The elegant black ink of Pamela's name seemed to mock him a stranger's promise, a transaction dressed up as matrimony. This wasn't how marriage was supposed to be. But then again, his first marriage hadn't exactly followed the script either. Mr. Reed. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, pulling him from his thoughts. The legal team is ready in conference room B whenever you are. Brian pressed the button, his voice steady despite the chaos churning in his chest. I'll be there in 5 minutes, Joshua. He stood, adjusting his midnight blue suit jacket armor against a world that had taught him the hard way that love was a liability he could no longer afford. The tailored fabric felt like a shield, the kind of protection he wished he'd had when his world came crashing down just weeks ago. From his vantage point 40 stories above the city, the skyline stretched endlessly, a kingdom of glass and steel he'd conquered through sheer determination. 4 weeks ago, he'd stood in this exact spot with his then-wife beside him, planning their anniversary trip to the Maldives. Now, those memories felt like scenes from someone else's life, a naive man who still believed in forever. The manila folder on his desk contained more than just Pamela's contract. Buried beneath it were the photographs his private investigator had compiled, evidence of his ex-wife's betrayal that still made his stomach turn. Images of stolen kisses in upscale restaurants, secret rendezvous at boutique hotels, and the final, devastating proof: his ex-wife accepting an engagement ring from his biggest business rival, while she was still wearing his wedding band. His phone vibrated against the glass desktop. A text from his younger brother. Man, you need to get some sleep. This deal isn't worth your health. A bitter smile crossed his face. Sleep had become a distant memory since that morning 3 weeks ago, the morning everything changed. It had started ordinarily enough, a routine check-in email to his accountant about quarterly projections. But by noon, when his private investigator's report landed in his inbox with a single damning photograph attached, ordinary had shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The betrayal wasn't just personal. His ex-wife had been feeding confidential information to Titanium Ventures, the investment firm that had been trying to acquire his company for years. What better way to infiltrate an empire than through the CEO's bed? The realization had left him hollow, furious, and dangerously vulnerable. Walking to the bar cart positioned near his bookshelf, Brian poured 2 fingers of Japanese whiskey, a gift from his mentor on the day he'd closed his first multi-million-dollar deal. Never let them see the cracks, his mentor had warned him. The moment they smell blood, they'll circle. He caught his reflection in the chrome ice bucket. Dark circles shadowed his hazel eyes, and his usually pristine appearance showed signs of strain. His jaw tighter, his shoulders more rigid. He looked exactly like what he was, a man betrayed. But he'd be damned if anyone outside these walls would see it. A sharp knock interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Come in, he called, straightening his posture, rebuilding the walls. His head of legal, Marcus, entered with another stack of documents, his expression unreadable. The board has reviewed Pamela Simons' background check, sir. Everything is cleared for the announcement tomorrow morning. Brian nodded, gesturing toward the conference table. Any red flags I should know about? None, sir. Her financial records are clean, her employment history is solid, and she has no prior connections to Marcus paused delicately. To your ex-wife or her associates. As far as we can tell, Miss Simons is exactly what she appears to be. A talented financial analyst looking for a career opportunity. Exactly what she appears to be. The phrase echoed in his mind like a warning. That's what he'd thought about his first wife too, until the mask slipped and the monster beneath was revealed. Good, Brian said, his tone flat. Marcus hesitated at the door. Sir, if I may. Are you certain about this? A contract marriage is a significant risk, especially given recent events. Brian's jaw clenched. The board made their position clear. Marcus. They want stability, a united front for the merger. This is purely business, nothing more. As Marcus left, Brian returned to the window, watching the city lights flicker to life below. Somewhere in that sprawling metropolis, Pamela Simons was probably preparing for tomorrow too, packing her belongings, saying goodbye to her old life, stepping into an arrangement neither of them had chosen out of love. He wondered what her reasons were. Everyone had a price, and he'd met hers without hesitation. $500,000 up front, full medical coverage, and a guaranteed executive position at his company after the contract expired. Clean, transactional, safe. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as he stood there nursing his whiskey and his wounds, was that Pamela Simons carried secrets far darker than a simple need for money. Secrets that connected her to the very woman who destroyed him. Secrets that would unravel everything he thought he knew about betrayal, revenge, and the dangerous game his ex-wife had been playing all along. The contract on his desk wasn't just a marriage agreement. It was the first move in a conspiracy that had been set in motion long before he'd ever heard Pamela's name. The conference room felt colder than usual, despite the late afternoon sun streaming through the tinted windows. Brian arrived first, as he always did. Control was something he refused to surrender, especially now. The long glass table stretched before him like a chasm, polished to mirror perfection, reflecting the recessed lighting overhead. He'd chosen this room deliberately. Neutral territory, corporate, devoid of anything remotely personal. Marcus had arranged the contracts in neat stacks at opposite ends of the table, each page flagged with colored tabs marking signature lines. 2 pens, identical Mont Blanc fountain pens, lay precisely centered on leather portfolios, everything symmetrical, everything transactional. Brian checked his watch. 6:47 p.m. Pamela was due at 7 o'clock sharp. He'd seen her photograph. Of course, the headshot from her company profile, professional and unrevealing. Dark hair pulled back severely, minimal makeup, a controlled smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked efficient, contained. Exactly the kind of woman who would agree to this arrangement without the messy complications of emotion. The door opened at 6:59 p.m. Pamela entered with the precision of someone who understood that punctuality was power. She wore a charcoal pencil skirt and cream silk blouse, understated elegance that spoke of old money, though Brian's background check had revealed her family's wealth was relatively recent. Her heels clicked against the marble floor with measured confidence as she crossed to her designated seat. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice cool and professional as she extended her hand. "Miss Simons." Brian's handshake was firm, brief. Her palm was surprisingly warm against his, a small human detail that felt out of place in this sterile negotiation. They sat simultaneously, an awkward choreography of strangers performing a ritual neither had rehearsed. "I assume you've reviewed the contract?" Brian opened his portfolio without preamble, flipping to the first flagged section. 3 times, Pamela replied, matching his businesslike tone. "My attorney examined it as well. The terms are comprehensive. I don't believe in ambiguity," Brian said flatly. "This arrangement has clear parameters. 1 year. Public appearances as required. Separate living quarters within the penthouse. No expectation of physical intimacy. At the conclusion of 12 months, we file for an amicable divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. You receive the agreed-upon compensation plus the executive position. Clean exit for both parties." Pamela's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her dark eyes, relief, perhaps, or calculation. "That aligns with my understanding." "Good." Brian pulled out the financial disclosure documents. You'll have access to a shared bank account for household expenses and public appearance needs. Monthly allowance of $50,000. All expenditures over $10,000 require prior approval. Understood. The conversation continued in this sterile vein for 20 minutes. Logistics, schedules, media strategy, emergency protocols. They discussed their arrangement with the emotional investment of two attorneys negotiating a corporate merger. Which, Brian reminded himself, was exactly what this was. Yet something nagged at him. Pamela's answers were too perfect, her composure too practiced. She hadn't asked a single question about his expectations, his habits, his boundaries beyond what the contract stipulated. It was as if she'd been preparing for this meeting her entire life. "May I ask you something off the record?" Brian said suddenly, breaking the script. Pamela's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "Of course. Why are you really doing this?" He leaned back, studying her face. "The money is substantial, yes, but you have a successful career. You could have found other opportunities. So why agree to marry a complete stranger?" For the first time, Pamela's controlled facade cracked. Her jaw tightened, and she looked away toward the windows, where the city lights were beginning to compete with the fading daylight. "Because sometimes," she said quietly, her voice losing its professional veneer, "a cage with golden bars is preferable to the one you were born into." The words hung between them, heavy with implications Brian didn't fully understand. Before he could probe further, Pamela straightened, rebuilding her walls with visible effort. "My family has certain expectations," she continued, her tone carefully neutral again. "This arrangement allows me to fulfill my obligations while maintaining my autonomy. It's a strategic move, Mr. Reed, nothing more." But it was more. Brian could see it in the way her fingers trembled slightly before she clasped them together, in the muscle that twitched near her temple when she mentioned her family. Whatever Pamela was running from, it carried weight. "Your family," Brian said slowly. "They approved this arrangement?" "They approved the outcome." Her smile was brittle. "The means are irrelevant to them." A strange kinship flickered in Brian's chest, the recognition of someone else wearing armor, someone else who'd learned that vulnerability was a luxury they couldn't afford. He pushed the feeling aside. Empathy was dangerous. This was business. "Then we understand each other," he said, pulling the signature pages forward. "Shall we proceed?" Pamela reached for her pen, but hesitated, her hand hovering over the document. For a moment, Brian thought she might change her mind, might stand up and walk away from this calculated arrangement. Part of him, a part he immediately suppressed, almost hoped she would. "One more thing," Pamela said, her eyes meeting his with unexpected intensity. "I need your word that you won't dig into my family history beyond what's in your investigator's report. My past stays mine. That's non-negotiable." Brian's instincts screamed warnings, but he was in no position to demand transparency, not when his own motivations were tangled with revenge and wounded pride. "Agreed," he said. "As long as your past doesn't become a liability to this arrangement." "It won't." They signed in silence, the scratch of fountain pens against paper marking the moment two strangers legally bound themselves together. No fanfare, no ceremony, just ink drying on contracts that would reshape both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. When the final signature was complete, Pamela stood, extending her hand once more. "I suppose I should say congratulations, Mr. Reed. We're engaged." "Brian," he corrected automatically. "We should probably use first names, for authenticity." "Brian," she repeated, testing the name like an unfamiliar word. "I'm Pamela, though I prefer Pam." "Pam," he acknowledged, though something about the informality felt wrong, too intimate for strangers playing house. As she gathered her portfolio and turned to leave, Brian found himself studying the way she moved, the rigid set of her shoulders, the deliberate pace of her steps. She carried secrets the way he carried his whiskey glass. Carefully, afraid of what might spill if she relaxed her grip. "Pam," he called out as she reached the door. She turned, one hand on the frame. "Whatever you're running from," Brian said quietly, "I hope this gives you the distance you need." Something softened in her expression, surprise maybe, or gratitude, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "The same to you," she replied. Then she was gone, leaving Brian alone in the conference room with signed contracts and the unsettling feeling that he'd just made a deal far more complicated than the terms suggested. He walked to the windows, staring out at the city where Pamela was already disappearing into the anonymous flow of evening traffic. Tomorrow, they would announce their engagement to the world. Tomorrow, the performance would begin in earnest. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of signatures and half-truths, Brian couldn't shake the memory of Pamela's trembling hands, or the shadows that had crossed her face when she spoke of her family. He'd agreed not to investigate her past, but as he stood there watching darkness claim the skyline, Brian wondered if that promise would become the biggest mistake of his life, or if the secrets Pamela Simons carried would prove far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. The engagement announcement had gone exactly as planned. By 10 a.m., Brian's PR team had flooded every major business outlet with carefully curated photographs of him and Pamela, smiling at each other with practiced affection, their body language suggesting a romance that existed only in the fiction they'd constructed. The board had called within the hour, their relief palpable. The merger could proceed. His company's reputation remained intact. Yet 3 days into their public charade, Brian found himself unable to shake an unsettling feeling that had taken root in his chest like a thorn he couldn't extract. It started with small things, insignificant details he initially dismissed as paranoia born from betrayal. The way Pamela tilted her head when listening, her chin angling slightly to the right. His ex-wife had done the same thing during their early courtship, back when he'd found the gesture endearing rather than manipulative. Then there was the laugh. Pamela rarely laughed. Their interactions remained cordially professional, but when she did, usually at something Marcus said during their planning meetings, the sound carried an odd familiarity. Not identical to his ex-wife's laugh, but close enough to trigger memories Brian had been trying desperately to bury. The third incident occurred during a dinner with potential investors at Le Bernardin. Pamela had ordered sea bass without glancing at the menu, the same dish his ex-wife had ordered there years ago. When Brian mentioned it, Pamela had simply shrugged, explaining it was her go-to order at French restaurants. Reasonable, logical. Yet the coincidence gnawed at him. "You're being ridiculous," Brian muttered to himself, standing alone in his home office on a Friday evening. Pamela had retired to her separate wing of the penthouse hours ago, maintaining the boundaries they'd established. He should be relieved by her professionalism, her respect for their arrangement. Instead, he felt increasingly unmoored, as if he were missing something crucial hiding in plain sight. His eyes drifted to the mahogany cabinet in the corner, the one containing old photograph albums from before everything went wrong. He'd avoided opening it since the divorce, unwilling to revisit happier times that had turned out to be elaborate lies. But tonight, driven by a compulsion he couldn't name, Brian crossed the room and pulled out the heavy leather-bound albums. The first album chronicled his early relationship with his ex-wife. He flipped past engagement photos, vacation snapshots, carefully avoiding the smiling faces that now felt like mockery. He was about to close it when something in a group photograph caught his attention. It was from a charity gala 5 years ago, one of those massive fundraisers where hundreds of wealthy donors mingled in ballrooms, writing checks and networking. His ex-wife stood in the center of the frame, wearing a crimson gown Brian remembered buying for the occasion. But it wasn't his ex-wife that made his blood run cold. Standing slightly behind her, partially obscured by other guests, was a much younger woman who bore an unmistakable resemblance to Pamela. The face was rounder, less defined by the sharp cheekbones she had now. But the eyes were identical, that same dark, penetrating gaze. Even the posture matched, shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to disappear into the background. Brian's hands trembled as he pulled the photograph closer to the desk lamp, squinting at the details. The younger woman wasn't looking at the camera. Instead, her attention was fixed entirely on his ex-wife. Her expression unreadable, but intense. "It can't be," he whispered, but even as he spoke, certainty settled over him like ice water. He grabbed his phone, zooming in on the digital copy his assistant had uploaded years ago for the company archives. The resolution was poor, but when he enhanced it, there was no denying the resemblance. The woman in the photograph was absolutely Pamela, younger, less polished, but unmistakably her. How had she known his ex-wife? Why had she never mentioned it during their background checks and contract negotiations? And most disturbing of all, had this entire arrangement been orchestrated from the beginning? Brian's mind raced through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. His ex-wife had enemies, rivals, she'd betrayed during her climb up the corporate ladder. Could Pamela be one of them, using this contract marriage as some elaborate revenge scheme? Or worse, could she still be working with his ex-wife, planted in his life for reasons he couldn't yet fathom? His phone buzzed with an incoming message. Speak of the devil, it was from his ex-wife's attorney, requesting a final meeting to settle remaining property disputes. The timing felt ominous, coincidental in a way that made Brian's paranoia spike even higher. He heard footsteps in the hallway, Pamela, returning from the kitchen. Without thinking, Brian quickly shoved the photograph back into the album and closed it, his heart hammering. When she appeared in his doorway moments later, wrapped in an elegant silk robe, he forced his expression into neutrality. "I saw your light on," Pamela said, her voice soft. "Is everything all right? You look pale." "Fine," Brian replied too quickly. "Just reviewing some documents." Pamela's eyes flickered to the closed album on his desk, then back to his face. For a moment, something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or wariness. She knew that he knew something had shifted. "You've been watching me differently the past few days," Pamela said quietly, not accusatory but observant. "If you have questions, Brian, you should just ask them." "Do you know my ex-wife?" The words escaped before he could stop them, sharp and direct. Pamela's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened around the doorframe. "I met her once, briefly, at a business function years ago." "Why? Which function?" "I don't remember the specifics. It was during my internship." Her tone remained even, but something defensive had crept into her posture. "Brian, where's this coming from?" "I found a photograph," he said, standing and crossing to where she stood. "You were there. At a gala. Standing right behind her. You looked." He paused, searching for the right word. "Familiar with her?" Pamela's face paled slightly, but she held his gaze. "I attended many events during my internship. She was a prominent figure. Of course, our paths might have crossed. You never mentioned it during our negotiations. You never asked if I'd met your ex-wife." Pamela's voice took on an edge, and frankly, it didn't seem relevant. "You wanted a business arrangement. I provided one. My past encounters with people in your social circle shouldn't matter." She was right, technically. Yet every instinct Brian had developed through years of cutthroat business deals screamed that she was hiding something. "What aren't you telling me?" Brian stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "I agreed not to dig into your family history, but this is different. If you have some connection to my ex-wife, if this is part of some scheme." "Scheme?" Pamela's eyes flashed with anger. "You think I orchestrated this? You approached me with this contract, Brian. Remember? Your team vetted me, not the other way around." She had a point, but it did nothing to ease the suspicion coiling in his gut. "Then explain the coincidences, the mannerisms, the way you order food, how you laugh, even how you move. Sometimes it's like watching echoes of her." Pamela's expression shifted from anger to something more complex. Was that guilt? Fear? Before Brian could read it clearly, she'd shuttered it away, rebuilding her walls with visible effort. "Maybe you're seeing ghosts because you haven't dealt with your past," she said coldly. "I'm not your ex-wife, Brian. I'm not responsible for whatever damage she caused you." "Then help me understand." "There's nothing to understand." Pamela's voice rose slightly before she caught herself, lowering it to a harsh whisper. "You're paranoid. You're looking for betrayal in every shadow because that's what you've been conditioned to expect. But I'm not her. And if you can't separate me from your trauma, maybe we should reconsider this arrangement." The ultimatum hung between them, a threat neither seemed ready to execute. Brian wanted to press further, to demand the truth he sensed she was concealing. But something in Pamela's eyes, genuine hurt mixed with determination, made him hesitate. "I need to know I can trust you," he said finally, his voice rough. "Trust is earned," Pamela replied, "but it's also given. You can't build it on suspicion and accusations. She turned to leave, pausing at the threshold. For what it's worth, Brian, I have my own reasons for being here. Reasons that have nothing to do with your ex-wife or whatever conspiracy you're imagining. But if you keep looking at me like I'm the enemy, this arrangement will crumble long before the year is up. As her footsteps faded down the hallway, Brian sank back into his chair, staring at the photograph album that had unraveled his fragile peace. Pamela was hiding something, he was certain of it now. The question was whether that secret would merely complicate their arrangement or destroy it entirely. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a darker thought emerged. What if his ex-wife had known about Pamela all along? What if this entire contract marriage had been part of a larger game, one where Brian was already several moves behind? He picked up his phone and typed a message to his private investigator. Need a deeper background check. Find any connection between Pamela Simons and my ex-wife. Spare no detail. The response came within seconds. Understood. We'll have preliminary findings by Monday. Brian set the phone down, his jaw tight with determination. Whatever Pamela was hiding, whatever role she played in this web of coincidences, he would uncover it. Trust might need to be earned, but in Brian's world, verification came first. Outside his office window, the city lights glittered like 1,000 watching eyes. And for the first time since signing those contracts, Brian wondered if he'd invited danger directly into his home. The investigator's report arrived at 6:47 a.m. on Monday, 48 hours after Brian had requested it. He'd barely slept since confronting Pamela, his mind churning through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Now, sitting alone in his office with coffee growing cold beside him, Brian opened the encrypted file with hands that weren't quite steady. What he read made the room tilt. Subject: Pamela Simons, née Pemberton. Father: Richard Pemberton, deceased 2018. Mother: Margaret Pemberton, formerly Hartley. Half-sibling, maternal. Subject's ex-wife, previously married name, withheld per client request. Connection confirmed through birth records and DNA analysis obtained from public genealogy database. The words blurred as Brian read them again, forcing himself to process what he'd suspected but hoped wasn't true. Pamela wasn't just connected to his ex-wife, they were sisters. Half-sisters, sharing the same mother but different fathers, raised in separate households after a bitter family split. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Emergency board meeting called for 10 a.m. They've received an anonymous tip about company vulnerabilities. Need you there. Brian's jaw clenched. The timing couldn't be coincidental. His ex-wife was making her move. Before he could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Pamela appeared in his doorway, still wearing pajamas, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger this way, vulnerable, and the resemblance to her half-sister was even more pronounced. We need to talk, she said quietly, her eyes finding the investigator's report on his desk. I see you couldn't keep your promise about not digging into my past. You're her sister. Brian's voice was flat, accusatory. You've been lying to me from the beginning. Half-sister, Pamela corrected, stepping into the office and closing the door behind her. And I didn't lie. You never asked about my family connections. Don't play semantic games with me. Brian stood, anger flooding through him. You knew exactly who I was. You knew what she did to me. And you still agreed to this contract. Why? What's your endgame here, Pamela? Or should I call you by whatever family name you share with her? Pemberton, Pamela said, her voice trembling slightly. My name was Pamela Pemberton, before I changed it to Simons when I turned 18. I took my stepfather's name to distance myself from my mother, and from her. Brian waited, his arms crossed, refusing to make this easier. Pamela sank into one of the leather chairs, her composure cracking. My mother had an affair while married to her father. That's how I was born, the shameful secret, the evidence of betrayal. My biological father was a financial analyst, not wealthy or connected like her father's family. When my mother's affair was discovered, she was given an ultimatum: abandon me and my father, or lose everything, her inheritance, her social standing, her marriage. She chose the money, Brian said, understanding dawning with sickening clarity. She chose her daughter. Pamela corrected bitterly. The legitimate one. The one whose existence didn't destroy reputations. I was raised by my father in a small apartment, while she lived in mansions. Growing up, I'd see photos of her in society magazines, this glamorous older sister I'd never met, living the life that should have included me. Despite his anger, Brian felt an unwelcome stab of sympathy. When did you finally meet her? 7 years ago. I was 22. Fresh out of graduate school, working as an intern at a financial firm. She showed up at a charity gala I was catering to pay my student loans. Pamela's laugh was hollow. She knew who I was immediately. Pulled me aside, told me our mother was dying and wanted to see me before the end. Did you go? Yes. Pamela's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I thought maybe, finally, I'd have the family I'd always wanted. But our mother died 2 days before I arrived. The funeral was brutal. Her family treated me like a stain they couldn't wash away. And Pamela's voice cracked. She looked at me with such hatred, like I'd personally destroyed her perfect life just by existing. Brian's anger began to shift, confusion replacing it. If she hated you, why would she orchestrate this contract marriage? Why put you in my life? That's what I've been trying to figure out, Pamela admitted, wiping her eyes roughly. When your team approached me about this arrangement, I thought it was just a coincidence, a strange twist of fate. But after we signed the contract, I started receiving messages, anonymous texts, telling me I was playing my role perfectly, that everything was proceeding according to plan. Show me, Brian demanded. Pamela pulled out her phone, scrolling through screenshots. The messages were chilling in their vagueness. You're doing well, little sister. Keep him distracted. And he still doesn't know what's coming. Neither do you. Brian's blood ran cold. Why didn't you tell me immediately? Because I thought I could handle it. Pamela's voice rose defensively. Because I was terrified that if I told you, you'd think I was part of whatever she's planning. Because... She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. Because for the first time in my life, I have power she doesn't control. This contract, this arrangement, it's mine, not hers. I didn't want to give that up. You think this gives you power? Brian laughed bitterly. We're both pawns in whatever game she's playing. His phone buzzed again, another text from Marcus. Board members received documents showing potential merger vulnerabilities. Someone leaked internal financial projections. This is serious. The pieces clicked together with sickening precision. His ex-wife hadn't just betrayed him personally. She'd been systematically infiltrating his company, gathering intelligence to sabotage the merger. The contract marriage was a distraction, Brian said slowly, his mind racing. She needed me focused on personal drama, while her real attack happened in the background. She planted Pamela in my life, knowing I'd eventually discover the connection and become paranoid, distracted. While she worked with Titanium Ventures to undermine your merger, Pamela finished, horror dawning on her face. Oh God, Brian. I've been getting investment advice from a consultant she recommended. I thought it was a peace offering, but she's been using you to access my financial networks. Brian interrupted, already pulling up his computer. Whatever consultant she sent you is probably funneling information directly to my competitors. He quickly initiated a security audit, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Within minutes, the damage became clear. Unauthorized access to confidential documents, copied files, strategic data breaches, all traced back to IP addresses connected to Pamela's consultant accounts. This isn't just about revenge, Brian said, his voice grim. She's coordinating with multiple business rivals. This is corporate warfare, and we're losing. Pamela looked devastated. I didn't know. I swear, Brian, I had no idea she was using me like this. Doesn't matter. Brian's tone was harsh, though he was beginning to believe her innocence. The board meeting is in 3 hours. If this information becomes public, the merger collapses, my company's reputation is destroyed, and we both become liabilities. Then we expose her first, Pamela said, steel entering her voice. She thinks I'm still her obedient pawn. She doesn't know I've figured out her game. We use that. Brian studied her, this woman who'd been thrust into his life under false pretenses, who carried secrets and trauma that rivaled his own. Despite everything, Despite the lies and manipulation, he saw genuine determination in her eyes. Maybe even alliance. "You'd betray your own sister?" he asked quietly. "She stopped being my sister the day she looked at me like garbage," Pamela replied. "And she made a critical mistake. She assumed I'd stay the powerless little girl she remembers. But I've spent my entire life fighting to matter, to be seen, to escape the shadow of a family that never wanted me. I'm not letting her win, not this time." Brian made a decision that would either save them both or destroy whatever remained of his empire. Then we worked together. Really, together, no more secrets, no more walls. If we're going to survive this, I need to know everything about her operation, every contact, every weak point, every piece of leverage we can find. Pamela nodded, extending her hand across the desk. "Partners?" "Partners," Brian agreed, shaking it. The handshake felt different than their first one weeks ago, less transactional, more genuine. They were bound now not just by contract but by necessity, by shared enemies and tangled histories neither had chosen. As Pamela left to gather her consultant files and communications records, Brian returned to the investigator's report, this time reading deeper. His ex-wife's conspiracy extended further than he'd imagined. Board members who'd received mysterious cash infusions, competitors who'd suddenly gained insider knowledge of his strategies, even journalists who'd been fed negative stories about his company. She'd been planning this for months, maybe years. The infidelity, the strategic betrayals, even her choice to marry into his rival's family, every move had been calculated. But she'd miscalculated one crucial factor: Pamela's capacity for rebellion. The sister she'd treated as worthless, as a tool to be used and discarded, had her own reserves of strength and rage. Brian pulled up his secure messaging system and began coordinating with Marcus. If they moved fast, if they could expose the conspiracy before the board meeting, they might salvage this. But it would require perfect timing and something Brian hadn't allowed himself in months: trust in another person. He glanced toward the doorway where Pamela had stood minutes ago, remembering the determination in her eyes. They were trapped in a web of deceit neither had woven. But perhaps together, they could tear it apart thread by thread. The battle lines had been drawn. His ex-wife had declared war through manipulation and sabotage, but she'd made one fatal error. She'd given Brian and Pamela a reason to fight back. And this time, Brian wouldn't lose. The full picture emerged like a photograph developing in acid slowly. Then all at once, each detail more damning than the last. Brian and Pamela sat across from each other in his private office, surrounded by printouts, financial documents, and email chains that painted a devastating portrait of manipulation. It was 2 a.m., 8 hours since their tentative alliance began, and what they'd uncovered made Brian's earlier suspicions look naive. "She started planning this 3 years ago," Pamela said, her voice hollow as she scrolled through recovered messages on her laptop. "Look at this correspondence between her and my mother before she died. They were discussing me like I was a chess piece to be positioned." Brian leaned over to read the email chain. His ex-wife's words dripped with calculated cruelty. "Pamela will do anything for family acceptance. She's desperate, lonely, and brilliant with numbers. If we can get her into his orbit when the time is right, she'll be the perfect distraction. He'll never suspect the girl he's trying to save. She wasn't even married to you yet when she wrote this," Pamela whispered, horror evident in her expression. "She was already planning to destroy you." Brian's jaw clenched. "What did your mother say?" Pamela's fingers trembled as she clicked to the next message. "Use her however you need. I've failed that girl her entire life. At least she can be useful to you. Just make sure she gets something out of it. I owe her that much." The casual dismissal, the transactional coldness, it made Brian's stomach turn. For all his ex-wife's faults, he'd never imagined this level of premeditation. This systematic destruction of multiple lives for what? Revenge? Power? Both? "Your mother sold you out," Brian said quietly. "She never wanted me to begin with," Pamela replied, her voice breaking. "I was always the mistake, the evidence of her infidelity. At least now I know she and my half-sister had one thing in common: they both saw me as disposable." Brian pulled up another file, this one from his forensic accountant. "It's worse than we thought. She didn't just infiltrate my company through you. She's been working with Titanium Ventures for 18 months, feeding them proprietary information in exchange for stock options and a guaranteed executive position after my company collapsed. So the affair, the divorce, all strategic, Brian finished bitterly. She married me to gain access to my business networks. She cultivated relationships with my board members, learned our vulnerabilities, then positioned herself with my biggest rival before burning everything down on her way out. The infidelity I discovered? She wanted me to find out. It was the catalyst to make me vulnerable, distracted, desperate enough to accept a contract marriage for stability. Which is where I came in, Pamela said, the full scope finally clicking into place. She recommended me to your HR team through a third-party recruiter. I thought it was coincidence when I got the job at your subsidiary company 6 months ago. But she'd been grooming me, positioning me, waiting for you to be desperate enough to notice the perfect candidate for your fake marriage. Brian pulled out his phone, opening a voice memo his investigator had sent an hour ago, a recorded conversation between his ex-wife and a board member named Gregory Hutchins. He pressed play. His ex-wife's voice filled the office, smooth and confident. Brian's distracted by his little contract bride. He still doesn't know she's Pamela Pemberton, my pathetic half-sister. When he finds out, and he will, it'll destroy whatever trust he has left in people. That's when we strike. The man's paranoia will be his downfall. He'll make mistakes, alienate the board, and Titanium can swoop in with a hostile takeover bid. Gregory's response was equally chilling. And the girl? What happens to her when this is over? Who cares? She's served her purpose. Brian will blame her for everything, and she's too weak to fight back. She's always been weak, desperate for scraps of family affection. It's almost sad how predictable she is. The recording ended. Pamela's face had gone pale, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles were white. She set me up to be destroyed too, Pamela said, her voice barely audible. I wasn't just a pawn. I was collateral damage she didn't care about. She underestimated you, Brian said, and was surprised to find he meant it. Over the past 8 hours, working side by side with Pamela, he'd seen her analytical brilliance, her meticulous attention to detail, and her core of steel beneath the vulnerability. His ex-wife had been wrong about one crucial thing. Pamela wasn't weak. She was a survivor. We need to confront her, Pamela said suddenly, anger replacing shock. Not through lawyers or board meetings. Face to face. She needs to know we figured it out. That's exactly what she'll expect, Brian countered. She's counting on emotional responses, on us making mistakes driven by anger. Then we give her what she expects. Pamela replied, a calculating glint entering her eyes, one that reminded Brian uncomfortably of her half-sister. But we control the narrative. She thinks I'm weak and desperate. Let her keep thinking that. She believes you're paranoid and isolated. We use that. Brian leaned back, studying Pamela with new appreciation. You want to set a trap. I want to destroy her the way she tried to destroy us, Pamela corrected. But smart. Strategic. Using her own tactics against her. Over the next hour, they crafted their plan with the precision of generals plotting warfare. Pamela would reach out to her half-sister, request a meeting under the guise of seeking family reconciliation. She'd play the desperate, confused younger sister, exactly the role her half-sister expected. Meanwhile, Brian would arrange a simultaneous meeting with Gregory Hutchins and the corrupted board members, ostensibly to discuss concerns about the merger. She'll be there, Pamela predicted. She won't be able to resist the chance to watch me grovel, to see me broken. Her ego demands it. And when she arrives, Brian asked, we have recordings, financial evidence, the forensic trail showing how she's been feeding information to Titanium Ventures. We expose everything not just to her, but to the board members she's been manipulating. We show them they've been played just as thoroughly as we were. Brian pulled up his contact list. I'll get our attorneys there, along with representatives from the SEC. If we're doing this, we do it right. She won't just lose her revenge, she'll face criminal charges for corporate espionage and fraud. Good, Pamela said coldly. Then her expression softened slightly. Brian, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but Do you believe me? That I didn't know the full extent of what she was planning? Brian considered the question carefully. Trust didn't come easily anymore, and Pamela had been part of his ex-wife's scheme, however unwittingly. But watching her work tonight, seeing her rage at being used, her determination to fight back, he recognized something genuine. I believe you were manipulated, Brian said finally. Just like I was. She's been playing us both from the beginning. But here's the difference. You're choosing to fight back. That counts for something. Pamela's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Thank you for giving me a chance when you had every reason not to. Don't thank me yet, Brian replied grimly. We still have to survive what comes next. She's not going to go down without a fight. And when cornered, people like her become dangerous. Then we better be more dangerous, Pamela said, her jaw set with determination. They spent the remainder of the night rehearsing their strategy, anticipating counterattacks, building contingencies. By the time dawn broke over the city, they'd transformed from reluctant allies into something more formidable. Partners united by betrayal and driven by the need to reclaim their lives from someone who'd treated them as disposable. Brian looked at Pamela across the desk, this woman who'd entered his life under false pretenses, who carried secrets that had nearly destroyed them both, who was now his strongest ally in a battle neither had chosen. Tomorrow, we end this, he said. Tomorrow, Pamela agreed. She learns what happens when you underestimate the people you tried to break. As they finally left the office to grab a few hours of sleep, Brian felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Not quite hope, but its dangerous cousin, the possibility of vindication. His ex-wife had orchestrated an elaborate revenge plot, had manipulated and destroyed, with calculated precision. But she'd made one fatal error. She'd given her victims a reason to unite, and in doing so, had created the very alliance that would bring her empire of lies crashing down. The war she'd started was about to reach its climax, and this time, Brian and Pamela would be the ones dictating terms. The conference room had become their war room. For 72 hours straight, Brian and Pamela had worked in relentless tandem, surrounded by whiteboards covered in financial flowcharts, timelines of suspicious transactions, and networks of corrupted contacts. Coffee cups littered every surface, and the city lights outside marked the passage of time they'd stopped counting. Here, Pamela said, highlighting another suspicious wire transfer on her laptop. $50,000 from an offshore account registered to Titanium Ventures, routed through a shell company in the Caymans, then deposited into Gregory Hutchins' personal account. That's the third board member we can prove took bribes. Brian leaned over her shoulder, close enough to catch the faint scent of her shampoo lavender, unexpected and somehow comforting in this chaos. He forced himself to focus on the screen. Transaction date matches the week before the merger vote was delayed. She paid him to stall us. She's been systematic, Pamela observed, pulling up another spreadsheet. Every board member who's shown hesitation about the merger has received funds from accounts we can trace back to her network. It's not just bribery, it's orchestrated sabotage. Brian straightened, rubbing his tired eyes. Somewhere during the past 3 days of working alongside Pamela, something had shifted between them. She'd stopped being the suspicious stranger thrust into his life and had become, what? A partner, certainly, an ally. But lately, he'd caught himself noticing things that had nothing to do with corporate warfare, the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, how her laugh sounded genuine now instead of practiced, the fierce intelligence that lit up her eyes when she connected another piece of evidence. We have enough to take to the SEC, Brian said, trying to keep his tone professional. Between the wire transfers, the recorded conversations, and the data breaches your consultant enabled. It's still not enough to stop her, Pamela interrupted, frustration evident. The evidence proves fraud and corporate espionage, but she's covered her tracks well enough that prosecution could take years. Meanwhile, she'll burn everything down around us. As if summoned by their discussion, Brian's phone buzzed with an alert. He pulled it up, his jaw tightening as he read. She's making her move. Business Insider just published an expose claiming I used insider information to manipulate merger negotiations. They're citing anonymous sources with intimate knowledge of my business practices. Pamela grabbed her own phone, scrolling rapidly. It's everywhere. Forbes, Bloomberg, TechCrunch. She's planted the story across every major outlet. And look at this. She turned the screen toward Brian, her face pale. They're calling me your accomplice, saying I was planted in your company to help facilitate the fraud. Turning the truth inside out, Brian said grimly, making us look like the conspirators while she plays victim. Classic misdirection. His phone rang Marcus, calling from the emergency legal meeting he'd convened with their attorneys. Brian put it on speaker. Brian, we have a problem. Marcus's voice was tense. 3 more board members just filed formal complaints about your conduct. They're demanding your resignation pending investigation. And Titanium Ventures announced a hostile takeover bid an hour ago, offering 30% above market value. With this media storm, shareholders are going to panic. She's forcing our hand, Pamela said, standing and pacing. The articles discredit us, the board turns against you, and Titanium swoops in as the savior. It's elegant, really, brutal, but elegant. There's more, Marcus continued. Miss Simons, your former employer filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against you this morning. They claim you stole proprietary information before joining Brian's company. It's all coordinated. To isolate us, Brian finished. She's cutting off our allies, our credibility, our resources. If we don't act fast, we'll be too damaged to fight back effectively. After ending the call, silence settled over the room. Brian walked to the window, staring out at the city that suddenly felt more hostile than majestic. Behind him, he heard Pamela moving, sensed her approach before she spoke. Brian, her voice was soft, closer than he expected. We knew this was coming. She's desperate, that's why she's escalating. We have the evidence. We just need the right moment to use it. He turned, finding her standing barely a foot away. In the dim lighting, exhaustion shadowed her features, but determination burned brighter. When had she become beautiful to him? Not the polished, controlled woman who'd signed their contract, but this fierce, complicated person who matched his intensity, step for step. The right moment might not come, Brian said quietly. She's always 3 moves ahead. Even now, she's probably anticipating our counterattack. Then we do something she won't anticipate, Pamela replied. We stop playing her game and create our own. Their eyes locked, and Brian felt the air between them charge with something beyond strategic planning. Pamela must have felt it too, because she swallowed hard, taking a small step closer. Pam, he began, then stopped, unsure what he'd intended to say. Thank you. I trust you. I'm starting to care about you in ways that terrify me. I know, she whispered. And somehow he believed she did understand the confusion, the growing connection neither of them had planned for, the way their fake marriage was becoming something dangerously real in the midst of chaos. Brian's phone shattered the moment, buzzing with another alert. This time it was a video message, sender unknown. He opened it with growing dread. His ex-wife's face filled the screen, perfectly composed in what looked like a luxury hotel suite. Her smile was cold triumph. Hello, darling, she purred. I hope you and my dear sister are enjoying your partnership. I must admit, watching you scramble has been more entertaining than I anticipated. But playtime's over. By tomorrow morning, I'll have controlling interest in your company, and you'll both be facing criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy. I've been gathering evidence for months. Fabricated evidence, beautifully documented. The SEC investigation will destroy you. She paused, her smile widening. Oh, and Pamela? Tell our mother I said hello. Oh wait, she's dead. And she died thinking you were worthless. At least she was right about something. The video ended. Pamela's face had gone white, her hands trembling with rage and pain. That's it, she said, her voice shaking. I'm done playing defense. She wants war. Let's give her war. What are you thinking? Brian asked, recognizing the dangerous glint in her eyes. She's in town. That video was shot at the Mandarin Oriental. I recognize the decor. She came here to watch her plan unfold in person. Pamela pulled out her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. She mentioned a meeting tomorrow morning with Titanium executives to finalize the takeover. If we can intercept that meeting, present our evidence directly to them, they might back out if they realize they're complicit in corporate espionage. Brian finished, following her logic. Without Titanium's support, her whole scheme collapses. Exactly. And we do it publicly. Invite media, SEC representatives, everyone. She can't manipulate the narrative if we control the venue. Brian felt something close to hope stirring. It's risky. If it backfires, we're already facing criminal charges and professional ruin, Pamela countered. What's riskier than doing nothing? She was right. And more than that, she was brilliant. Brian crossed to her, and before he could second-guess the impulse, he cupped her face in his hands. When this is over, he said quietly, we need to talk about what's happening between us. Pamela's breath caught. Brian, we're in the middle of... I know, but I need you to know. He paused, searching for words. This stopped being fake for me. Somewhere between the paranoia and the partnership, you became real. This became real. Tears glistened in her eyes. For me too, she admitted. And it terrifies me, because everything I've ever wanted has been used against me. But with you, she placed her hand over his. It feels different. Like maybe I'm finally choosing something for myself. They stood frozen in that moment, balanced on the knife's edge between professional alliance and something far more dangerous. Then Pamela smiled genuine, unguarded, and pulled back gently. But first, she said, we take her down. Together, Brian agreed. They spent the rest of the night finalizing their plan, occasionally brushing hands as they worked, exchanging glances that carried weight beyond words. The bond forming between them was unexpected, unwanted by either of their original designs, yet undeniable. By dawn, they had their strategy. The battle would be fought on their terms now, in public view, where his ex-wife's manipulation would be exposed for all to see. As the sun rose over the city, Brian looked at Pamela exhausted, fierce, beautiful in her determination, and realized that whatever happened next, he was no longer fighting alone. And perhaps that made all the difference. They arrived at Brian's estate at 11:47 p.m., exhausted from finalizing their strategy to expose his ex-wife's conspiracy. The security guard waved them through the gate's familiar face, routine procedure. Brian didn't think twice about it until later, when he'd replay those moments searching for warning signs he'd missed. The penthouse was dark when they entered, illuminated only by city lights streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Pamela headed toward the kitchen for water while Brian moved to disable the security system, fingers entering the code on autopilot. That's when he saw it. The red light that should have been blinking wasn't. The system showed armed, but the backup indicator was dead. Pam, wait. Brian started, but movement exploded from the shadows. 3 figures materialized, professional, efficient, wearing tactical gear that absorbed light. The first one rushed Pamela, grabbing her from behind before she could scream. Brian lunged forward, but the second operative intercepted him with brutal precision, driving a knee into his ribs that sent him crashing into the marble counter. Corporate problems require corporate solutions, the lead operative said, his voice flat and emotionless beneath a black mask. Miss Reed sends her regards. Brian's ex-wife had escalated beyond manipulation and fraud. She'd hired professionals to eliminate them permanently. Pamela twisted violently in her captor's grip, her elbow connecting with his face hard enough to draw blood. Years of self-defense classes from a childhood spent navigating dangerous neighborhoods kicked in. She drove her heel down onto his instep, and when his grip loosened, she grabbed the heavy crystal vase from the entry table and swung it with desperate strength. The vase shattered against the operative's temple. He staggered, cursing, and Pamela ran not away, but toward Brian, whose attacker had him pinned against the counter with a knife pressed to his throat. "Get off him!" Pamela screamed, launching herself at the second operative. Her weight threw him off balance just enough for Brian to twist away from the blade, which sliced across his shoulder instead of his neck. Pain exploded white-hot, but adrenaline overrode it. Brian grabbed the knife-wielding operative's wrist, using the momentum to slam him against the refrigerator, They grappled, training versus raw desperation, until Brian managed to disarm him and send the knife skittering across the floor. The lead operative, recovered now, pulled a gun from his tactical vest. The cold click of a safety being released echoed through the kitchen. "Enough games," he said, aiming at Pamela. "You first. Make him watch." Time crystallized into sharp focus. Brian saw Pamela's eyes widen, saw her preparing to dive for cover, saw the operative's finger beginning to squeeze the trigger. Without thinking, driven by instinct and something far more powerful, the primal need to protect someone he'd come to love, Brian threw himself between the gun and Pamela. The shot never came. Instead, sirens wailed outside, growing closer, accompanied by flashing lights that strobed through the windows. The lead operative swore viciously in Russian. "Abort," he barked to his team. "Window extraction, now." The three operatives moved with practiced efficiency toward the balcony, using rappelling lines Brian hadn't noticed attached to the exterior. Within seconds, they'd vanished into the night, leaving chaos and blood in their wake. Pamela stood frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth, staring at Brian. You stepped in front of a gun for me." "I couldn't." Brian's voice cracked. His shoulder was bleeding heavily, and the adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by shock and pain. "I couldn't let him hurt you." The door burst open, security team and police flooding in, responding to the silent alarm Brian had managed to trigger during the fight, but Brian barely registered them. His focus remained locked on Pamela, who crossed the distance between them in 3 quick steps. "You idiot," she said, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her hands against his bleeding shoulder. "You absolute idiot. You could have died." "So could you," Brian replied, his hand coming up to cup her face, blood smearing on her cheek. "And I realized something in that moment, when I saw that gun pointed at you. I can't lose you. This stopped being fake the moment I was willing to die to keep you safe." "Brian," Pamela's voice broke. "I'm in love with you," he said, the words tumbling out with the clarity that only near death brings. "I don't know when it happened. Maybe when you refused to back down from her. Maybe when you chose to fight beside me instead of running. But somewhere in this mess, you stopped being a contract and became everything." Pamela was crying openly now, her hands trembling as paramedics rushed in to assess Brian's wound. "I love you too," she whispered. "God help me. I fell in love with you somewhere between suspicion and partnership. And it terrifies me because everyone I've ever loved has used me or left me." "I'm not going anywhere," Brian interrupted, gripping her hand fiercely despite the paramedic trying to treat his shoulder. "Do you hear me? Whatever happens next, we face it together." The lead paramedic, a woman with kind eyes and efficient hands, finally managed to separate them. "Sir, you need stitches, possibly surgery. The cut's deep. And you, ma'am," she addressed Pamela, "you're going into shock. Let us help." As they were both examined, Brian's shoulder requiring 18 stitches, Pamela treated for bruised ribs and minor lacerations, the full scope of the attack became clear. The security guard at the gate had been drugged and replaced with an imposter. The mercenaries had disabled backup systems with military-grade equipment. This wasn't amateur hour. His ex-wife had hired professionals who specialized in corporate elimination, disguised as home invasions. "She tried to have us killed," Pamela said hours later, sitting beside Brian's hospital bed. He'd refused to be admitted, accepting outpatient treatment so they could return home to safety, to planning, to finishing this war. "She's escalated beyond anything we anticipated." "Desperation," Brian said, his voice rough from pain medication. "We got too close to exposing her. This was her nuclear option, eliminate the threats before we could present our evidence." Pamela's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She opened it, then showed it to Brian, her hand shaking with rage. "So close. Next time, I'll hire better help. Sleep well, little sister. If you can." The taunt was meant to terrify them into submission. Instead, it ignited something colder and more determined than fear. Brian watched Pamela's expression harden, saw the exact moment she transformed from victim to warrior. "She made a mistake," Pamela said quietly, her voice deadly calm. "She showed us exactly how scared she is. People who are winning don't hire mercenaries. They wait for their plans to succeed. We have 24 hours before her meeting with titanium executives, Brian replied, his strategic mind cutting through pain and medication fog. She'll expect us to be traumatized, hiding, maybe even running. She won't expect us to attack. Pamela leaned forward, careful not to jar his injured shoulder, and kissed him soft at first, then deeper, carrying all the fear and relief and desperate love of two people who'd nearly lost everything. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "We end this tomorrow," she said against his lips. "Not just for us, but for everyone. She's manipulated and destroyed. We take her down so completely she'll never threaten anyone again." "Together," Brian confirmed, linking his uninjured hand with hers. "No more running, no more defense. Tomorrow, we bring the war to her." They spent the rest of the night planning, despite exhaustion and pain, fueled by love and rage in equal measure. The attack had stripped away their final pretenses, the emotional walls they'd both maintained, the professional distance that had felt safer than vulnerability. Nearly dying had clarified everything. This wasn't a contract marriage anymore. This was two survivors who'd found each other in the wreckage of betrayal, who'd chosen to stand together against impossible odds, who'd discovered that sometimes the most powerful weapon against cruelty was the refusal to be broken. As dawn broke over the city, Brian pulled Pamela close, mindful of her bruised ribs and his stitched shoulder. They were battered, furious, and terrified, but they were alive, and they were united. His ex-wife had intended the attack to destroy them. Instead, she'd forged them into something far more dangerous. Partners who had nothing left to lose, and everything to fight for. The final confrontation was coming, and this time, they would be ready. The boardroom of Reed Industries had never felt more like a battlefield. 23 directors sat around the massive glass conference table at 9 a.m. sharp, their faces ranging from concerned to hostile. Brian, his shoulder still bandaged beneath his tailored suit, took his seat at the head of the table with Pamela beside him, a deliberate choice that spoke volumes about their united front. "Let's begin," Gregory Hutchins announced, his voice carrying false authority. "We've called this emergency session to address serious allegations regarding Mr. Reed's conduct and the integrity of our merger negotiations. Allegations planted by someone who stands to profit from this company's destruction," Brian said calmly, meeting Gregory's eyes with unwavering intensity. "But we'll get to that." The boardroom doors opened, and Brian's ex-wife entered with the confidence of someone who believed she'd already won. She wore a crimson power suit, her hair perfectly styled, her smile sharp as a blade. Behind her came representatives from Titanium Ventures, and most damagingly, a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. "I wasn't aware media would be present at a private board meeting," Brian said, though his tone suggested this was exactly what he'd anticipated. "Transparency is crucial during times of corporate crisis," his ex-wife replied smoothly, taking a seat across from him. "The public deserves to know how their investments are being managed. Or mismanaged, as the case may be." "Interesting that you'd mentioned transparency," Pamela said, her voice steady despite the fury Brian could see simmering beneath her composed exterior. She opened her laptop, connecting it to the boardroom's projection system. "Because we have quite a bit of that to share today." His ex-wife's smile faltered microscopically, the first crack in her armor. "Before we begin," Gregory interjected nervously, "I want to state for the record that this meeting is about Mr. Reed's questionable business practices and his inappropriate marriage arrangement designed to manipulate board perception." "Is it about that?" Brian interrupted, standing. "Or is it about the $50,000 you received from an offshore account registered to Titanium Ventures 3 weeks before you voted to delay our merger? Would you like to explain that transaction to your fellow board members, Gregory?" The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Gregory's face went pale, then red. I don't know what you're talking about." "Financial records don't lie," Pamela said, pulling up the first document on the projection screen. "Wire transfer, March 15th. From a Cayman Islands shell company owned by Titanium Ventures to Gregory Hutchins' personal account. Same pattern repeated with board members Johnson and Fitzgerald. 3 votes purchased to sabotage our merger. This is preposterous." Gregory sputtered. But his eyes darted toward Brian's ex-wife, a tell so obvious even the titanium representatives noticed. "You want to talk about inappropriate arrangements?" Brian continued, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Let's discuss the systematic corporate espionage orchestrated by my ex-wife over the past 18 months. Pamela, show them the communications." The screen filled with email chains, text messages, and recorded phone conversations, all meticulously documented evidence of the conspiracy. Brian's ex-wife remained seated, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the armrest. These communications show coordinated efforts to steal proprietary information, manipulate board votes, and sabotage business relationships, Pamela explained, her voice gaining strength with each word. "What they don't show is the full extent of the manipulation. So let me fill in those gaps personally." She stood, meeting her half-sister's gaze across the table, with decades of pain and rage finally unleashed. "My name is Pamela Pemberton Simons. Some of you may recognize the Pemberton name. It's the maiden name of the woman sitting across from me. My half-sister. The woman who orchestrated my entry into Brian's life, not as a coincidence, but as a weapon." The boardroom fell into stunned silence. Even the reporter had stopped typing, transfixed by the revelation. She knew our shared family connection would eventually destroy Brian's trust in me and mine in him. Pamela continued, her voice trembling slightly but unwavering. She counted on us tearing each other apart when the truth emerged. What she didn't anticipate was that we'd choose to stand together instead. "This is absurd," Brian's ex-wife started, but Pamela cut her off with a gesture so forceful it silenced the room. "I have recordings of conversations between you and our dying mother, discussing how to use me as a pawn in your revenge plot. I have documentation of how you planted a consultant in my life to access Brian's financial networks through me. I have evidence of how you hired mercenaries to eliminate us when we got too close to exposing your conspiracy." Pamela's voice broke slightly on the last word, but she pushed forward. "You tried to have us killed. Your own sister and the man you once claimed to love. You ordered our execution like we were obstacles to be removed." The titanium representatives exchanged alarmed glances. This was no longer a simple corporate takeover. It was conspiracy to commit murder. Brian pressed a button on his phone, and the boardroom doors opened again. This time, SEC investigators and federal agents entered, along with the firm's legal team. "We've provided all evidence to the appropriate authorities," Brian said, his voice hard as steel. "The SEC has been investigating Titanium Ventures' role in this conspiracy for the past 72 hours. Gentlemen from Titanium," he addressed the visibly panicking representatives, "you might want to consult with your legal team before saying anything further. You're now accessories to corporate espionage, fraud, and attempted murder." The Titanium executives stood abruptly, making urgent phone calls as they rushed from the room. The carefully orchestrated takeover was crumbling in real time. Brian's ex-wife finally stood, her composure shattering. "You think you've won? You've destroyed your own reputation. You married your ex-wife's sister. How does that look to shareholders? To business partners? It looks like two people found each other in the wreckage of your betrayal," Brian replied quietly. "And unlike you, we told the truth. This board meeting is being live-streamed to our shareholders and recorded for legal proceedings. Everything you've done, everything you've said, it's all documented." The blood drained from her face as she realized the trap she'd walked into. By bringing the media, by grandstanding publicly, she'd ensured her own exposure would be equally public. "Gregory, Johnson, Fitzgerald," Brian continued, addressing the corrupted board members, "you have until end of business today to resign. If you don't, criminal charges will be filed for accepting bribes and violating fiduciary duty. The choice is yours." One by one, the implicated board members gathered their belongings and left, their careers in ruins. The remaining directors, those who'd maintained integrity throughout the conspiracy, sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what they'd witnessed. Brian turned to his ex-wife one final time. "You wanted to destroy me. For what? Because I succeeded where you failed? Because your own ambition consumed you and you needed someone to blame? You manipulated your own dying mother, weaponized your sister, corrupted our company's board, all for revenge and power. Was it worth it?" She said nothing, but the defeat in her eyes spoke volumes. Federal agents approached, reading her rights as they prepared to escort her out. The investigation would take months, but the evidence was overwhelming. Her career, her reputation, her freedom, all would be forfeit. As she was led away, she locked eyes with Pamela one last time. "You were always weak," she hissed. "Always desperate for family that never wanted you." "You're wrong," Pamela replied, her voice clear and strong. "I found my family, and unlike the one we were born into, this one is built on truth, trust, and love. You'll spend years in prison wondering how you lost. The answer is simple. You underestimated the power of people who choose each other instead of destroying each other." The doors closed behind the agents and their prisoner, leaving a boardroom full of directors who'd just witnessed the end of an era. "I want to address the elephant in the room," Brian said, turning to face the remaining board. "Yes, I entered a contract marriage with Pamela as a business arrangement. But what started as a transaction became something real. We fell in love while fighting to save this company from destruction. I won't apologize for that. If any of you take issue with our relationship or believe it compromises my ability to lead, I'll understand if you vote for my removal." The board members exchanged glances. Finally, the senior director and woman named Patricia, who'd been with the company since its founding, spoke. "Mr. Reed, you've just saved this company from a hostile takeover orchestrated by someone we all trusted. You exposed corruption within our own ranks and protected our shareholders' interests at significant personal risk. Your relationship with Miss Simons is frankly none of our business, and given what we've witnessed today, it seems to be the most honest thing about this entire situation." She smiled slightly. "I move that we confirm Brian Reed as CEO and proceed with the merger, as originally planned." The vote was unanimous. As the meeting adjourned and directors filed out, many stopping to shake Brian and Pamela's hands, to thank them, to express shock and support, the couple finally found themselves alone in the massive boardroom. Brian pulled Pamela close, mindful of her healing bruises and his stitched shoulder. They fit together perfectly now, no longer the awkward strangers who'd signed contracts in this same building months ago. "We did it," Pamela whispered against his chest. "We did," Brian confirmed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Together. What happens now?" she asked, pulling back to look at him. "The contract is technically still in force for another 8 months. Brian reached into his pocket and pulled out the original contract they'd signed, the document that had started this entire journey. With deliberate ceremony, he tore it in half. "No more contracts," he said softly. "No more transactions or business arrangements. Just us, building something real. If you'll have me not as an employee or a contracted wife, but as a partner in every sense of the word." Tears glistened in Pamela's eyes. "I thought you'd never ask." He kissed her, then, deep and genuine, a promise and a beginning rolled into one moment. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling through tears. "Let's go home," Brian said, taking her hand. They walked out of the boardroom together, leaving behind the battlefield where they'd won their freedom. The company was safe. The conspiracy was exposed. The woman who'd tried to destroy them was facing justice. But more importantly, they'd found each other, two damaged people who'd been used as weapons, and chose instead to become each other's sanctuary. As they stepped into the elevator, Pamela squeezed Brian's hand. "Think we'll get our happily ever after?" "I think," Brian replied, squeezing back, "we'll get something better. We'll get real, messy, complicated, beautiful, and real." The elevator doors closed, carrying them toward a future they'd build together, not bound by contracts or conspiracies, but by choice. They'd both been broken by betrayal, used as pawns in someone else's game. But in fighting back, in choosing trust over suspicion and love over fear, they'd become something neither had expected: whole. Their story hadn't ended in the boardroom. It had only just begun. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought, and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.